All right, everybody, good to see you. Welcome to the first lecture in History 1301. You're in the right place. First lecture is going to be called Bunny Rabbits Gone Wild. Here you're trying to figure out what in the world is that about. So what I want you to do is think about bunny rabbits. What do bunny rabbits have to do with anything with regard to American history, any history for that matter? So of course I'll clue you in later, but try to think about that. What in the world is going on here? In any case, thinking about ancient civilizations or ancient cultures in the Americas. When I say the Americas, I mean North and South America, not America, the country, or the United States, or anything like that. We're talking about these two continents you see in blue as opposed to the rest of the world. These are two continents that no one knew about really until after Columbus. Probably some Vikings showed up a little earlier, and of course, maybe some indigenous peoples from Alaska and that kind of thing. But essentially, as far as we're concerned, no one knew about it. It's totally isolated, totally off in itself, and that'll show itself in the lecture as we go. So, again, when I say the Americas, that's what I mean. Now, we want to talk about Native American tribal people. That's a mouthful. Most people are just going to say Indians. I'm probably going to say Indians most of the time. You might ask why. Why is that? Well, the reason is Columbus. We'll talk about Columbus in a few minutes. Columbus was making a journey west from Europe, and because he knew the world was round, as most people did, he assumed that if he sailed rather west from Europe somewhere, that he would end up in one of two places, either in China or in India. But when he lands in the Caribbean or the Caribbean, I've heard it both ways, he knew he wasn't in China, so he thought he was in India, some outlying islands of India, and so he named the people Indians, and of course that stuck. So there's a lesson there for you in that at this period of time, 1500 CE or current era or AD if you're old school like me, but current era is the new way we say it. At this period of time, Europe, particularly Western Europe, basically ruled everything, and this is kind of the center of everything. Yes, there are other cultures going on, of course, China and others, but this is where, certainly Western civilization is happening, and this is the birthplace, the bed place of America. So this is where we are. So that's what happened. So I'm probably going to use the term Indians most of the time. And so that's what I mean. Very rarely, if ever, does the subject of the actual nation of India ever come up in particularly U.S. History 1301. So that's what's going on there. Now, what we want to do is start thinking about the people as they started settling down. So the word for that is sedentary. And that's your first college word, by the way. You can use that on your kids when they need to get up from the video games, especially right now. Everyone's kids are home, schools are closed, all that stuff's going on. You can use the word sedentary on them. But all it means is you sit down, you settle down. You have a job where you sit in a chair, you have a sedentary job. Pretty simple. The question we want to talk about here is why did these people settle there? And of course, you see on the screen the answer is resources. It's about water, it's about food, it's about climate, it's about defense, probably other reasons we could add on there. But it comes down to resources. That's why they're settling. And you might be saying, wait, there are some people that lived in some pretty inhospitable places, like in the deserts in the southwest United States, northern Mexico. People thrived there. Look in Alaska or the north, where you have the Eskimos and they live in just basically ice. Well, that's true. And there's, again, a lot of reasons why people would settle. Sometimes they want to be isolated. Sometimes that's where they get pushed to. But very often it's about resources and about them deciding that they're tired of following the woolly mammoths or whatever it is, and they decide that they want to move on and do something else. So as we go on here, start thinking about what happened to these people, right? Why they settled down, which we talked about, resources. Again, think about it. If you have resources, if you have good resources, that's going to be a way for your people to thrive. Now, the other question here is how do we know about them? You can see on the screen, you got a skeleton. Someone's brushing the dirt off of the skeleton, and you got this person digging in these very nice looking holes. That's a lot different than the sandbox I had when I was a kid, but it's the same principle. What we know about these people, particularly the farther back in time we go, is based on the things that we dig up. It's based on the work that archaeologists do. As they find something, they dig it up, they explore the area, and they learn things about the people that live there. You want to know the truth, an archaeologist's job, really, is digging through people's trash. And the older trash, the better. Problem is, the older trash, the less of it there is. But this is how we find out about people. We dig up their stuff. We dig up what they left behind. They certainly didn't leave us a book or a picture book. These people usually don't have any kind of writing. They certainly don't have a way to preserve any kind of documentation if they even do that. So we get pottery, we get bones, we get just fragments of things, and then that gets dug up and people make educated guesses. I mean, imagine if someone took your trash. Today's trash day for us. My trash can's about this tall, full of stuff. There's 8 people in my house, right? I don't know if you know that. Some of you don't. I have 6 kids. There's a whole bunch of people living here. I know you think that's crazy, especially now as we're all isolated together. But in any case, I have a lot of trash that comes out. But imagine if someone looked at your trash and tried to make some determination about what you were like, what your life was like, what kind of food do you eat, what sort of milk do you drink. My house would have regular whole milk, it would have almond milk, and it would have some kind of weird coconut milk, and it probably lactate. I think we have all 4 of those. So they might learn a little bit. They would decide, hey, someone's lactose intolerant. And again, looking through all those things, we can make determinations about what these people were like and what these people did. So if you want to be an archaeologist, cool. Very rarely are you going to be digging or looking through something like a pharaoh's tomb, which is full of gold, or you're going to be doing something like Indiana Jones, which I highly recommend if you've never seen Indiana Jones, for sure. Raiders of the Lost Ark, the first one is great, and that's super glamorous, right? It's not what most of this is. Most of this is like the kid you see in the hole, just digging, digging, and digging. But that's how we know about these people. All right? So as we move on here and we think about some of the different groups of people I want to talk about, you're looking at a picture of the Poverty Point culture. This is a kind of a drawing, a recreation of what we found. Basically, there's a mound here, and it's in Louisiana, in this area called Poverty Point, Louisiana. Here's another lesson for you. They're not real clever at naming things a lot of the time. So you have here the Poverty Point people. They could have named them the Louisiana Fire Swamp people or something interesting, but no, it's the Poverty Point people. That's what sticks. You can see the timing here. They lived about 1500 to 1000 BCE. That's before current era, or if you're old school like me, that's just BC. Basically what happened is in the last, few decades, of course, there's a secular sentiment. We want to get rid of any religious overtones, so they took out AD, which is Anno Domini, and BC, which is before Christ, and they made it BCE, which is before current era, and CE, which is current era. So AD and CE are the same, BC and BCE are the same. Same 0 year, so whatever that means. Anyway, you can see that they lasted for about 500 years, and I'm giving you very general terms, general dates. Dates do not figure heavily in this class. You're not going to have to memorize dates, but I'm trying to give you dates so you can understand where things fit on the timeline. So you can see they kind of live on this hill, and there's the part of the Mississippi River, the Delta going by there, and you have all these rows where they're planting crops, and you have these mounds where probably some religious significance to that. So very typical of tribal people across the world is that they are mound builders. And here's a pretty simple example. And if you look on every continent, you're going to find people who built mounds, primarily because they're the easiest structures to build. So you'll find them in Europe, England, Africa, Asia, Australia, and of course here in the Americas. So these people, we don't know a lot about them. We know they ate fish, they ate squash. That's primarily what they planted. We also know they had no cattle. And that's an important feature we're going to talk about later, but just to introduce that idea, they don't have cows or horses or pigs or sheep or any kind of domesticated animals like that. And so that means that they're not going to get as much work done. That means they're going to be relying more on manpower than on animal power. And that means they're not going to be able to build as much, do as much. So again, as the archaeologist, someone discovered this site, they dug through it, they found basically where they threw all their trash, and they dug it up. And about 1500 to 1000 BCE, that's 3500 to 3000 years ago, that these people were living there. The question for us is, what happened? What happened to the people? Why aren't they still there? What made them go? Well, we'll talk about that a little bit more as we go. Now here's a next group of people. We call these the Hopewell people. They're much more broadly dispersed throughout what we'd call the Midwest of the United States and kind of up and down the Mississippi. And you see 200 BCE to about 200 CE. Much larger group of people, kind of dispersed groups, not all one tribe. Here what you see is one example of the mounds that they built. And you see this is shaped like a serpent. They're pretty famous for building all these mounds that have these animal shapes. There's geometric shapes. There's all sorts of things like that. Kind of a weird question or weird way to think about this. You can't really see what this is if you're on the ground with it. You need to be up in the air to see it for what it is, to see its shape. And that kind of begs the question, how did these primitive people do that? Of course, one answer is aliens, right? You all know, you all were thinking it, that aliens could be the answer. Whenever there's something you can't explain, you just say aliens. And you watch History Channel, especially H2, they're always talking about aliens. I don't know. I don't really think there's aliens, but we'll see. Now, they're mound builders. Again, we don't know a whole lot about them because they lived 2,000 years ago. But just for a moment, just kind of compare them to the Roman culture at the same time period. This period of time is kind of the height, the beginning and the height of the Roman Empire, right? Later on, again, we'll talk about them some more. But think about, these people are building mounds shaped like serpents, which this is pretty complicated. And I'm assuming they did the math, and that's how they did it, rather than having to fly. And then you have the Romans at this time building things like the Colosseum, building roads that are still in use today, 2,000 years later. I mean, it's a big difference. So we'll, again, come back and talk about that. I want to know, again, what happened to these people where they only were around for 400 or 500 years. Third group we can talk about is the Chaco Canyon people, about 800 to 1200 current era, so 1,200 years ago. This is desert living in the southwest United States and Mexico. And these people, you might have heard of the Anasazi if you've driven through New Mexico or Arizona, southern part of California, or if you've been in West Texas, even into Mexico, you'll find these kinds of ruins there. And this is pretty complex buildings in the middle of the desert. This is an example of people that chose to live somewhere that was fairly inhospitable. And in addition to that, these people are, by and large, are growing maize or corn. Maize is talk about maize again too in a minute, but maize is a sort of primitive form of corn. You see it every year in the grocery store when you go around the fall and you get the weird looking corn that's all the different colors and shapes. That's what maize is. You can eat it. It's not as sweet or as tender as the yellow corn that we typically eat here in the United States. But the point here is they were able to grow corn by utilizing pretty complicated irrigation systems. Again, what happened to them? They only lasted for a little while. These are the questions that archaeologists and historians ask. Let's talk about maize for a minute, and then we'll talk about what happened to all these people. So maize, as you see the picture here, is this funny looking corn with the blue and red and yellow and white kernels. And again, it can come in a lot of different shapes. So note on the map that you see, especially the North and South America, you can see Mesoamerica there on the left. Maize and beans are essentially crops developed thousands of years ago in Central America, and they spread through North America and South America. And you See beans and potatoes down there, right? You can see how they spread. Now, again, remember, until basically Columbus, this part of the world doesn't really exist. No one really knows about it. There's no contact really between them and the rest of the world, either Africa, Europe, or Asia. No one knew it was there. If you look on the map of Europe and Asia and Africa, you can see again things like yams, wheat, rice, huge important staples of civilization and how they spread. So there is not any community between the two, right? They don't exist. There's no there's no potatoes, right, in Europe or Africa or Asia. There's no rice really in the Americas. There's no corn in Europe, Africa, Asia. There's no wheat, for example, in the Americas. So these are things that are going to come up later. We got maize. So now, what happened to these people? Well, before we compare them to world cultures, just start thinking about them using those resources. So they go and park themselves in some region, and they want to stay there usually because they like it, and so they grow crops and they thrive and things go really well. So here's the bunny rabbit thing. I said bunny rabbits gone wild at the beginning of this lecture. Here's the bunny rabbit thing. When you have a boy and a girl bunny rabbit, and I hope really that I'm not overstating anything that your parents haven't told you already, but if you have a boy and a girl bunny rabbit, you're going to get a lot of bunny rabbits. And the only thing that's going to limit that is the amount of food they have and the amount of predators they have. But we're talking about people. We don't really have any predators. All we worry about is food. Same thing happens, by the way. If you have a boy and a girl and you put them together long enough, things happen and you get babies. And again, I hope I'm not overstepping your parents. In any case, it just doesn't happen as quickly, but it happens quicker than you think, probably. So what happens is when you have people and you have food sources, think about like what maize does, you're going to have a lot of people. You're going to use resources. So if you stay in Chaco Canyon, or let's say the Hopewell people or the Poverty Point people, they're going to stay there because they like it. They're going to chop down trees. They're going to use that lumber to build things. They're going to use it to cook with and so on. And eventually they cut down a lot of trees. Eventually there's more and more people. Too many people to support in the local area. As they plant crops, the longer you plant crops in the same place, the more difficult it is to keep continuing to produce those crops. It depletes the soil unless you take care of it. And these people are primitive. They don't understand all these principles. Chopping down trees also causes erosion. They might out-hunt or over-hunt the areas they're in. So there's a lot of reasons that happen that make people leave, right? So when you have people and they eat well, they will have a lot of children. Those children more of them will survive into adulthood, and they will have more children, each one of them. The opposite is true when the diet gets bad. You'll have fewer children, fewer of those children will survive. You become more susceptible to diseases, and so you kind of reach this critical mass where the society can't sustain itself, and so they tend to fall apart, right? And these primitive cultures, tribal people, this is true throughout the world, they have a real problem with this. They can't overcome this. As you compare them to, say, China, and you can see on the upper right corner the Great Wall of China, and this thing's been built over 2,000 years basically, but parts of it were begun back in 500 BCE, and it's been worked on ever since. You got the Greece Parthenon down on the bottom right, that was built in the 400s BCE. You got the Roman Colosseum, the top left picture, that was built in 70 to 80 current era. You got feudal era castles, which I don't have a picture of, but 1,000 current era. And then you got, this is Notre Dame here in the middle. And that was, those are built basically post 1300 Renaissance cathedrals. These are cultures that are very advanced, building things and doing things that you don't generally see the native populations anywhere doing that kind of thing. So as we get to some of the differences, I'm going to just give you one really big one, and that's cattle. I mentioned earlier that the natives in North and South America don't have cattle. Those animals don't exist on this part of the world until after the explorers show up. So Columbus, others come along, and they will bring these animals with them. Those animals will escape, some of them, and they'll find places to thrive, and those animals will do very, very well. But cattle means everything. Cattle is something that totally transforms or has the potential to transform a culture. So they do several things. One, better food source. Remember the general rule, the bunny rabbit principle. The better food source you have, the more people you're going to have. And that's why these other cultures like Rome, Greece, you could add Egypt, you could add, again, we had China. All these cultures, these have a lot of people, millions of people. Rome had over 100 million people within its borders at one point. There are millions of people living in places like Rome, the city, or Jerusalem, and places like that. And those kinds of numbers are insane when you're thinking about tribal people. They would never be able to uphold that kind of population. So automatically you have a better food source because you have all these animals that you can go out and harvest for food. The second thing they provide is work and resources. So leather, wool, that kind of thing, which again, you would have less access to. You don't have domesticated cattle, but also the work themselves. I mean, we use a term called horsepower today still that discusses kind of the relative power of an engine or ability to work, right? All three of my kids have sports cars. My three oldest boys, I should say, all have sports cars. All of them have 400 plus horsepower. It's ridiculous. They're a lot of fun. You don't really need them except to go fast. But in terms of doing work, you can harness a horse or a couple of horses to a wagon. You can pull a lot more weight. You can harness them to a pulley system, and you can lift heavy beams or stones. That's why those cultures like the Chinese and the Greeks and the Romans and feudal Europe were able to build these big structures because they can use animals to leverage that. Also travel, things like that. The third point, and maybe the most important, is disease, at least in terms of the native people here, the Indians here. And disease, things like smallpox, influenza, viruses. Again, we're in the middle of this COVID-19 thing where we're trying to stay away from each other and we're doing all these things, and it's nowhere near as deadly as some of these. The problem is when you live around these animals, you develop a kind of resistance to these diseases. But when you have never seen these animals, you have zero resistance. So just something as simple as the flu, which can be deadly, but usually isn't. In the case of the natives in America, it's super deadly. And you can see on the screen, estimates are 80 to 90% of the natives were actually killed by disease over the course of the next 200-300 years. There are still a handful of native tribes that are protected, like in the Amazon. And if they come in contact with people, most of them are going to die. So disease, sadly, will decimate the population. We'll talk about Columbus in a minute and kind of how that works. So the bottom line here is tribal people, because they don't have cattle, and there's other reasons, but this is a way to really understand it. They don't have the time and the resources to build a lot. You just don't see much of that on this side of the world. So till very, very late. And then at that point, again, they'll start having animals, and of course they'll use slave labor and different things like that. So cattle means a lot. Now let's talk about Christopher Columbus for a few minutes. So, we have Columbus Day in October, and Columbus kind of gets a bad rap sometimes. I'm not saying he was a great guy, but one thing you got to deal with in history is you got to remember that people are who they are. And people are products of their time. So what is it about Columbus? So what you see on the screen here is a map of what people basically thought the world looked like in 1492. Now, most people thought the world was round. Most educated people anyway. The Greeks figured out the world was round a couple thousand years earlier, but their math was wrong. Columbus was a map maker by trade, and he thought the world was round, and he's decided that he wants to go west. And the primary reason he wants to go west is because of commerce, right? You can see on this screen commerce. Things like spices, perfume, steel, silk, many other things. You think about some of these things. Spices. We generally use spices to make our food taste good, but they used them to make their food taste less bad. We use perfumes, I hope, to smell good, not to cover up the bad. They used them to cover up the bad. Things like steel and silk were products that you couldn't get in Europe. You couldn't create in Europe. You could create steel in Europe, but the steel in the Middle East, for example, is far better than the steel they could create in Europe. Our crusaders, when they went, they found that out the hard way. So there was an arms race to get steel, like say Damascus steel, brought back to Europe. And if you had that, then you had a military advantage. Silk can only be developed in certain regions. So if you were wearing silk, that showed off how wealthy you were. The reality is most people in the world are poor. It's not like today where there's a large middle class, and again, Americans, even the poor ones, are richer than practically everyone else in the world. In these days, there's think of a teardrop, which is very small at the top and has a long sort of strip where it's very narrow, and then at the very bottom there's this big rounding of water, right? So economics here is the same way. There's a very small percentage of people that are wealthy, and by and large, most of the population are at the bottom. They're poor. And so Columbus has this idea that if I just sail west, I'll be able to get these products, and I'll be able to bypass all of the trade routes that are happening. So to go to China, you have to sail from Europe down south around Africa, down south around the Horn of Africa, up the other side, and then over to India, then over to China, and then back. No one sailed around the world. No one sailed across oceans. You stayed close to the land because they didn't know how to navigate. And so it's a very long process. So by the time anything returns to Europe, again, spices, perfume, silk, whatever these things are, they're super expensive. That means only the very wealthy can afford it. So Columbus wants to bypass that. The land route's even worse. It goes through, 20 different countries, and you got to pay taxes, and there's bandits, and there's pirates, and there's losses, and spoilage, and all this. So what Columbus basically is trying to do is short circuit the whole process. And he thinks, if I can just sail west, I'll get to China or India. Remember, that was his mistake, right? He thought he was in India, so he called the people Indians. But he was not wrong, except he didn't account for there being these entire continents in the way, right? So what we're going to end up with is something called the Columbian Exchange, where Columbus accidentally discovers what we'll call the New World, and all these products. We mentioned some of them: corn and potatoes and melons and beans, and later things, important things like medicines. They discovered that if you chewed these certain leaves, you felt really good. And then after a while, they discovered that it also killed you, and they actually discovered cocaine, or the plants that cocaine's derived from. They discovered it was a bad idea. Point being, though, that's the Columbian Exchange. And then things in Europe, like wheat and other products, were brought to the Americas. And so there's this exchange. Unfortunately, diseases were brought over, too. That's part of the exchange. Now, don't worry. The natives got a little bit of payback. They got, you've heard of syphilis, I suppose. That came and was brought back to Europe, although it was never as devastating. But even things as mundane as insects and weeds, again, the cattle, right? Their cattle came over. Some of them got out, and wouldn't you know it, in Brazil, in central Mexico, and in central United States, there's huge plains where those animals thrive. And today there's, millions of these animals running around doing their thing. So Columbus does that. I don't want to belabor that point too much. He made 4 or 5 trips back and forth before he died. But imagine the scene when Columbus shows up. Imagine if you're the natives and you see, Columbus, or you see something. And remember, Columbus was given 3 ships, right? The Nina, Pinta, and Santa Maria. And so he sails across, and just about the time everyone's starting to get sick and die from things like starvation or lack of good food and that sort of thing, they're starting to get worried. They run across some islands, which again are the Caribbean now, and they landed. So imagine being a native and you're looking out there and you see this something, and you're doing your daily business. Remember, you spend all your time trying to make ends meet. Native people, tribal people, spend all of their time trying to make sure they have enough food for the next day or the next season, whatever the case is, right? So you're going about your business. And then you see something on the horizon. Well, as it gets closer, it becomes three somethings. And then eventually you recognize that there's some kind of sailing boat or vessel. And eventually you realize there's beings on there. But in your experience, you can't place that. So kind of what happens is you assume they're messengers from the gods, perhaps. And so, how are you going to treat those people? You're going to treat them well. They're going to, as those boats get close enough, those ships get close enough, you're going to stop what you're doing and paddle out there in your canoes, and you're going to engage in some trade and so on with these beings. And again, they're Spaniards, so they're white. Some of them are probably wearing armor. They have guns. They speak a funny language and all this. And so you don't really know how to treat them. You treat them well. And so there's some trade's going to get on. Of course, on the other side, from the sailor's perspective, what are they doing? They're sailors. They're thinking about land, fresh food, women, and alcohol in some particular order, right? And all of those things are going to be provided for them once they set foot on these islands. Fortunately, some of them were sick. Some of them were carrying diseases. That's going to make people sick. And so, eventually, of course, the natives very quickly really start getting sick, but they don't just get fever and, stuffy nose or cough. They get deathly ill and start dying. And it doesn't take long before the connection is made between the arrival of these people. You've realized they're not messengers from God. They're just people from another place who have more technology than you. And so you've connected their arrival with this plague, and you have a couple options. You can try to fight and get rid of them. Probably all of you are going to get killed. There's few of them, but they have guns and steel weapons. You have none of that. So no one wants to be the first into that kind of fight, right? So the other option would be to run away or to leave. So you leave the island. You go to the next island. Of course, you've now infected people on the next island. This is why in the current crisis we're dealing with here in Texas and in this country, the social distancing thing is important, because don't communicate the disease, it stops there. They don't know that. They don't do that. This will rage through South America and North America. And it, as we said earlier, eventually, again, with much more contact, not just from Columbus, but with years and years of more contact, it's going to decimate the population. So 100 or so years later, when the British show up in North America, for example, there are far fewer natives there than there would have been. So think about what that means for colonization. In any case, that's kind of what happened. So Columbus makes a few turns. He does end up dying somewhere along the way. They bring back specimens. They bring back natives to Europe. The natives, don't survive in that kind of environment. They don't survive on ship, kind of being enclosed. The disease usually gets them. Very few survive. Now, the last thing we're going to talk about here is called the Treaty of Tordesillas. There's several pieces of this, but essentially in 1493, the Pope, right? You can see the Pope set something called the line of demarcation between what he gave to Portugal, which is everything, as you're looking at the screen, everything to the right. So like Africa and Asia, basically the non-Christianized portions of the world, to the right of the line they give to Portugal, and everything to the left, which they really have no idea what it is, they give to Spain. You can see Brazil sticks out over the line. They didn't know that when they drew the line. Again, a lot of different lines are created after that, and treaties signed and so on. But the line was so important that the people in Brazil speak Portuguese. The rest of South America pretty much speaks Spanish. Because of who went there first, who got control of the area. Now, again, why not some of the other countries? Basically, Spain and Portugal are in the Pope's good graces. England, France, others aren't so much. A lot of turmoil in Europe, which we're going to talk about in our next lecture. So the reason I bring this up here is because this illustrates how powerful the church is in world affairs, that kings and queens have to listen to the Pope, right? So this divides, again, the known world or the unknown world between Portugal and Spain. And that's why those two countries become very, very wealthy early on in this period. And that's why most of our explorers in the West are Spaniards, because they're the ones that got control. So that's it for the lecture. The next lecture, we're going to call it A Brave New World. We're going to talk about things like the Protestant Reformation, and we're going to get into British colonization of North America. So kind of be looking for that. Appreciate your attention. I hope this went well. Go ahead and email me with your feedback, how this went, what you thought of it, if it was too slow or too fast or too much. Normally, of course, I would be lecturing in class. I would be writing things on the board and drawing terrible pictures for you and that sort of thing. But any case, let me know what you thought. Go ahead and, of course, be looking at doing your key terms, your Voices of Freedom assignments, and that sort of thing as we go. Appreciate your attention and hope to get back with you soon.